Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Fur and Fam YouTube channel. In this week's episode, we're going to go through the steps that we took to first lay our subfloor and the grid that goes under it, and then we're going to go into what we did to get our spray foam installed. So we've already got our subfloor on top of our subfloor frame, but we've got some pictures that we're going to show to illustrate what our framing looked like underneath the floor. We put down 2x4s that we ripped in half and tied them all together, and then used some silicone adhesive and some boards that we drilled into the side of the van to hold the floor down during the spray foam process. The other thing we're going to talk about in this episode is our spray foam insulation. So we chose spray foam to get the best R value and the best sealing that we could possibly get from any type of insulation. So now we're going to go into a little more detail that our time-lapse footage will help with to show exactly what we did and why we did it. We ended up getting a lot of use out of the table saw for the framing that we put underneath the floor. What we did is bought 14-foot long 2x4s and ripped them in half. And the reason that we did this is I wanted one continuous piece running front to back in the van. And it turns out that in our '04 T1N Dodge Freightliner Mercedes Sprinter, whichever brand you want to call it, they're all the same, the cargo area is exactly 14 feet long. Now I did have to trim out a really small section of the floor that was in the driver/cab area, but I only cut out about 2 inches, and there was still some room between the seats and the floor framing. So I ripped down the 14-foot long 2x4s, made some basically floor joist that would go in the van, and then I started measuring in order to figure out how I was going to span between them and tie them together, because running lengthwise of the van, unless I just glued them all to the floor, they would probably walk around and rattle and things of that nature. Now the spray foam would have dampened that a little bit, but still I wanted to have a solid frame underneath the floor so that when I started installing cabinets and building bed platforms and things of that nature, we'd have a good solid base in order to attach things to. And so we got the 3 main runners going down the middle of the van, and they're roughly like 18 inches apart, and the outsides, those are I think like 14 on center apart from each other. So I decided to add a good bit of blocking in between. And now if you look at like 3/4 OSB sheathing that you use for a floor in a house, it's actually rated for floor joist being 24 inches on center. So I really didn't have to put any of the blocking in. The OSB would have spanned that distance just fine, and it shouldn't have flexed too much. I mean, there would have been some flexure in the floor when you stepped and walked around, but I really didn't want to have any of that because, one, the van's already moving and flexing a good bit, so any bit of movement that we could take out I thought would be a good idea. So what I did is I ended up making blocking to go in between that was 16 inches on center. So that's your standard distance for studs in a wall on a house. And once I got all those laid in, I marked every 16 inches running up the middle, and then I started to screw everything together. And basically, I wasn't super concerned about how precise the floor went together and the dimensions of which like the front to back dimensions, because the van itself has a slight variation from front to back and from side to side for that matter, and the floor was dented in some places, so it wasn't perfectly flat to start with. So what I did is I took a measurement at the front, a measurement at the back, and cut the pieces to fit where they would space out the front and the back widthwise, is pretty much as close as I could get them. And then I started assembling from one end and worked my way back. And so basically I just used some wood screws and screwed everything together. And in most places I only put 1 or 2 fasteners in each end of the boards. Once I got to the 16-inch on center blocking, I did only use 1 there because the blocking was smaller than a standard 2x4 in order to fit on top of the ribs that were running lengthwise down the van. You can kind of see in the picture there, because the actual 14-foot long runners, they sit on the very bottom floor of the van, and there's actually some like divots or actually the ribs, I guess, are inverse of the ones that stick up into the van. So there's depressions in the van under those. So I actually cut 1/2 inch plywood that fit under those. And you can't see them in this picture, but they're laying under in those depressions to make it where when you step there, that there would be no chance that the wood frame would flex at all. So it's touching metal pretty much everywhere that you would be able to step. And so working the way to the back, screwing everything together, I finally got smart and figured out that if I just offset the blocking by 1/2 inch, then I could just run a deck screw into each side of the blocking instead of having to toenail it, basically. And what toenailing is when you take a screw, really it's for when you're nailing studs in a wall, is you can nail at an angle, like a 45-degree angle, through the stud and go into the bottom plate when you're doing a wall. And a lot of times it'll cause the piece of wood to split. And I was pre-drilling some when I was putting all this together, but most of it I was just running it together with deck screws, because I knew once I put the spray foam in, that would tie it together, and once I put the OSB on top of it, that would really lock everything in and there wouldn't be much movement. And so I had to frame out around the wheel welds and get those to have a good base around, because I didn't want any sheathing, OSB sheathing, just hanging off the side of the frame. So I framed all the way out to the walls. And there's actually like a 2-inch gap between the very edge of the wall and where the framing is. And the reason that I did that is because the van has a little channel right there, and then it kind of steps up and into that side, like the wall piece basically. And the framing wouldn't fit perfectly in those channels. So that's why I came in. I think it ended up being like 1.5 to 2 inches in some areas. Like the wheel welds right there, right under where I'm sitting right now, that one is flush against the wheel well. There's literally no space between the wheel weld and it. But farther back, like where I'm starting to work now, over on the outsides of the van, those pieces are slightly inset. And one thing that we did in order to hold the floor down, because I was kind of concerned that as I started spraying spray foam, like you can really see it there, right to under the tape measure, basically that last piece of blocking, there's little gaps underneath where when I sprayed spray foam, I was worried that the spray foam would actually pick up the substructure of underneath the floor. And that did happen a little bit. I should have done a little bit better job of getting the floor to hold down flat. But in order to combat that, I took small pieces of I think it was a 1x4, and actually screwed down to the sides of the wall. So basically, you'll see them coming up here in a minute, where all I did was screwed into the horizontal section of the wall, and as I tightened that sheet metal, self-tapping sheet metal screwed down, it pulled the floor down. So around the perimeter of the van, the floor was locked in and could not rise. And in the middle of the van, I took a lead acid battery that probably weighs close to 100 pounds, and then I took a cooler and filled it up with water and put it like in the middle of the van, basically underneath the fan opening and underneath the AC opening. And I actually put silicone under those to join the floor structure to the actual metal in the van. So all in all, including the screws that we used to put it together and all the lumber in the floor framing, I think it ended up coming in under $50. And that was one of those moments when I was building and I realized, man, working with 84 square feet, like, you actually don't spend much money on supplies. Now, I mean, you can clearly go overboard with lithium batteries and Victron inverter chargers and all kinds of things like that, but if you really want to build a van on a budget, the materials that you have to buy to do it are really low in price compared to a house. Just because, like I said, 14 feet long by 6 feet wide, you've only got 84 square feet to work with, and for the cost of materials to build 84 square feet, you can actually do a lot on a really tight budget. So don't get discouraged if you're looking at building a van and you just think, oh man, I see all these really nice vans and everyone says they cost $50,000 to build. Like, if you really want to build a van on a budget and you have the time to do it, you can build a van on a budget and it can still look nice and you won't break the bank. So here you can see I'm putting in the pieces on the sides that hold the floor down on the sides. That's the little 1x4 that I was talking about earlier with some self-tapping sheet metal screws. And once we got all the spray foam in, I ended up sawing those off and being able to run the OSB all the way up to the sides when we came in and put the floor in. The other thing that we're doing here is we're taping off as much of the metal that we can, that we want to leave. And in hindsight, we probably should have taped off the two lower sections of metal that you can see below the wall studs, because we ended up having to scrape some spray foam overspray off with paint scrapers, and that took a lot longer than pulling the tape off. So if I did it again, I would definitely do more taping, which Lauren spent a lot of time taping all that off, but I think we'd spent twice as much time cutting it and scraping it all off of the sections that we didn't tape up. So we're covering up our windows. So we basically just bought some plastic sheathing. We'll put a link to that in the description below if you're interested in buying the same stuff that we used, and a couple rolls of duct tape, and that basically covered up all of our windows and doors, and we eventually covered up the cab so we wouldn't get any spray foam in there either. So when it comes to van insulation, there's a couple different routes you can take. We obviously chose to go the spray foam route, and for us it made the most sense because in an older van we were kind of concerned about having everything sealed and having good sound dampening, and we really wanted a high R value because we are considering maybe if we need to leave the dogs in the van with the AC running, something like that, we'd want to use as little power as possible while the dogs are in the van, and we're not. Another thing is the speed of installation with spray foam. I mean, once I started spraying, it only took me about an hour and 15 minutes and the whole van was insulated. Now that doesn't include cutting the spray foam, which, I mean, all in all, about a weekend's worth of time we were able to complete the entire spray foam process. And that wasn't working full days. I mean, that's an hour here, an hour there kind of thing. Some of the cons, what drive people away from using spray foam insulation, is the cost. It's probably the most expensive way to insulate a van. I think our kit, we used a Dow Froth Pack 650 kit. I'll put a link below to that as well in case you want to buy the same exact kit that we used. I'm really pleased with how the kit sprayed. The instructions that came with it were great. All of that was as best as it could be for how nervous I was to spray it, because if you mess up spraying spray foam, it is a nightmare to remove. I can vouch I accidentally made the mistake of not taping the doors. You'll see later once we get to that section, I'll talk about it a little more. And we got a little bit on the outside of the van, and that stuff is on there pretty good. It has not come off yet, and it's been almost a month since we spray foamed. So if you mess up spray foam, it can be a nightmare to get it out and redo it, basically. Another thing that kind of scares people away from spray foam, and one thing that made me really nervous, is one, if you apply spray foam too thick, the chemical reaction will generate a large amount of heat and can actually deform the panels of the van. So, and this is kind of typical if you pay someone to do it that typically spray foams houses, because they're used to being able to just squirt it in between two 2x4 studs 3 inches thick and just let it expand. And if the wall in your house flexes a quarter of an inch, who cares? You can't see it, it doesn't matter. But in the van, if your van mushrooms out a quarter of an inch everywhere, you'll notice it. So that's one thing I was really, really nervous of. And like getting it in the cavities behind where the inner frame of the van is, basically between the outer frame and the inner frame, I was really careful with how much I sprayed of the Dow Froth Pack into those cavities, because the expansion rate on it was actually really, really quick. Probably within 20 to 30 seconds, the foam had expanded to full strength. And so what I did is I got in there as best I could and then came back later with a can of great stuff to get those areas. So for me, I don't really know why, but the spray foam was one of the most nerve-wracking parts of the van build so far. I think more so it was just the fact of like wondering if I was making the right decision and hoping that I wouldn't mess up spraying it and worrying that the mixture wouldn't be right and the foam wouldn't expand and I just have a big mess to clean up. I mean, all those things that people like tell horror stories of spray foaming and whatnot. And so like I read the manual that came with the Dow Froth Pack kit, I think like 3 or 4 times front to back the day before. Made sure I knew like all the troubleshooting, like if one chemical was flowing and the other chemical wasn't, like what to do and how to notice it and when to stop and how to put new nozzles in the gun. And I knew the time that I had between where I could stop spraying and start spraying and the gun wouldn't freeze up because of the mixture solidifying in it. Um, I just, I was really, really worried about it, but it turns out spray foam is really not that hard to spray. Fortunately, what we're doing here is we're waiting on the temperature of the van to get just right. The sun was pretty hot, and so the outside shell of the van was like 140 degrees, which on this the kit that we used, we wanted to have the temperature of what we were spraying and the chemicals we were spraying be really close to being the same. So I got an infrared heat gun and I just go out and shoot the van every 20 minutes, waiting for it to cool off. Luckily, we had a little bit of cloud cover, and towards the end of the afternoon, we had more clouds, so the sun stopped baking the van basically, and everything came to about the right temperature, which for our kit was 75 degrees. So I think the air was 75 degrees, the van ended up being about 80 degrees when I started spraying. So temperature's getting close, pulling our weights off the floor so we can get started spraying. So pretty much, if you're considering spray foam for your van and you're worried about all the things that could go wrong, yeah, there's a chance that some things could go wrong with spray foam. Are the consequences a little more severe than the other methods like fiberglass, sheep's wool, R-board, and great stuff, Reflectix, not putting any in? Yeah, might be a little harder to redo some spray foam stuff. But in the end, like I said before, it's actually really easy to spray. I mean, the stuff will stick to anything. I was able to spray it up in the ceiling and it stuck in the ceiling. Sprayed it in the walls, it stuck in the walls. You just kind of get a system down and basically go for it. So while we're waiting on the van to get the right temperature, I want to go into a little bit more detail on some of the other types of insulation and why we did not choose them. So I guess a popular one that you see a lot these days is sheep's wool insulation. That does have a pretty decent R value, and it comes in battens that you basically just stuff into cavities, but that requires you to put a lot of thought into how you're going to hold it in the van, how you're going to suspend it in there until your walls get up, and it takes a while to stuff the stuff in everywhere. Another thing is it doesn't block condensation and moisture buildup as well as spray foam. And the same kind of holds for fiberglass insulation. Those two for me are kind of in the same category. So then there's R-board and the Great Stuff method, which basically you buy R-board from Lowe's or Home Depot and put it into the cavities and then spray Great Stuff around it, which Great Stuff is really just spray foam in a can. It's not two-part, it's single stage, or single one part that you shake up and mix in a spray can. But it's effectively the same stuff. It's made by the same people, Dow, that made our froth pack kits that we're spraying here. So that if I hadn't done spray foam, that would have been my second choice. You can also use like Reflectix and Thinsulate and things of that nature. Word of caution with Reflectix is you do have to have an air gap for Reflectix to be any bit to give you any insulation value. If you sandwich it between two materials, I think the R value is like not really anything at all. You'd almost be just as well off having no insulation. So that's just a quick rundown on the other types of insulation that we considered and the reasons why we didn't really pick those. We felt that the spray foam sealed the best, gave us the best protection against condensation and moisture inside the van, would make the van the most quiet when driving down the road. We could install it rather quickly, and it has a really high R value. We ended up with R12 to R13 pretty much everywhere in the van once we were done with the spray foam. The kit that we got like I said earlier, it was the Dow Froth Pack 650. It had plenty of foam in it to get the van done. I ended up at the end, I was basically just spraying it on the wall, spraying it everywhere, trying to run it out until I ran out with it. And I did the floor, both walls, and the ceiling all the way to the front of the van. One thing that I do wish I had done when I was spraying it is in my plan of attack that I devised before I started spray foaming. You probably saw when I started on the wheel welds because those really didn't matter. They were going to get covered with cabinetry and whatnot, so you wouldn't be able to see them, and it would be a good place to test out the spray foam. I then moved to basically shooting a real quick bead in all the small cavities around the edges of the bigger panels. And I did this because if I had started to spray the bigger panels first, I was worried that the foam would expand out and close the opening and not allow me to get foam behind the wall inner and outer portions. And so I did all of those first. And two, that kind of gave me a gauge for how fast I needed to be spraying in order to not get too thick of a foam buildup. What I wanted was about a 1/4 inch layer wet, which would end up being roughly a 1/2 inch to an inch thick once it dried. And I think for the most part, I was probably closer to like an 1/8 inch wet. I really sprayed it on too thin. And so if I ever do another van, which I will definitely use spray foam again, but if we ever do another van and if we end up using spray foam, I will definitely spray a little slower. And one thing about the Dow Froth Pack kit for the spray foam is that it comes with a bunch of different nozzles. And I used the cone nozzle the entire time because like I said, I was nervous about it. The whole thing just kind of made me uneasy. And so once I started spraying, I was just kind of in the zone, just spraying everywhere and not really just rolling with it, basically, just getting that foam in the van as fast as I could. And I wish that I had slowed down and taken the time to change nozzles. Because the cone nozzle, yeah, it gave me some good coverage, and I got foam everywhere that I needed foam, but my pattern was not super thick. I mean, you saw earlier when I was doing the roof, I kind of just waved it around everywhere like a wild person, getting it in all the places. But the kit actually came with a fan nozzle. And so I would have been able to just make a nice smooth pass, just as if I was painting the outside of the van with a high-end spray gun. I'm sure the pattern wouldn't have been quite as nice, but pretty much it would have allowed me to get a lot smoother coverage and a lot more even coat rather than kind of starting on the outsides and working in the middles, and then on the roof panels I just started at one side and worked over and kind of tried to spray a thin coat. It would have definitely helped to have the fan nozzle put in. And looking back, changing out the nozzles really isn't that hard. On the particular kit we used, all you have to do is hit the ejector button and put a little Vaseline in there and pop a new one in. Like, I really could have just done that and it wouldn't have mattered really at all. And I would have got a lot better coverage. So that's something I would definitely advise doing if you plan on using the Dow Froth Pack kit, which I've watched plenty of videos on people that use the Home Depot kit and use the Foam It Green kit. From what I saw, the Foam It Green kit, yeah, it's green and eco and all that stuff, but the foam doesn't expand as well and you don't get as much out of it as the other kits. The Home Depot kit, people had good things to say about it, but I just went with something that I could get off of Amazon and have it delivered pretty quickly because ended up needing it in a pretty tight timeline and Home Depot couldn't get it and they were going to have to ship it and all this stuff. So I just went with what Amazon could get to us the fastest. And another thing is, if you are going to use a spray foam, make sure you put on a Tyvek suit and use a respirator and wear goggles that cover your entire face. Because when you're spraying the ceiling, I came out of there, that entire suit was covered with spray foam. And it sticks to everything. It'll stick to your skin, it'll stick in your hair. There's nothing that it will not stick on. Yes, it was miserable spraying it in a suit. I think I sweated about 55 gallons and came out soaking wet, but definitely better than having that stuff all over me. So that's pretty much it for why we chose spray foam, the tips and tricks for getting the spray foam in the van. And also, I'm sure you saw that I did not have the plastic over the doors, and that's what I was talking about earlier. When I sprayed the corners of the van, it was such a windy day that some of the spray foam got on the sides of the door. And eventually we might buff the van to try to get it out. It's not really super noticeable, so I'm not super concerned about it, but it just kind of, like, as soon as I was done spraying, it just kind of pissed me off because I realized that I was stupid enough to actually do that and let it get on the outside of the van. So make sure you tape off over your doors as well as the outside of the van when you do it. And so now we're getting into the part where we are cleaning up the van and getting the excess spray foam removed. So basically we just bought a wood saw that was really, really long in order to be flexible enough to bend and get in all the joints. And I actually have a shorter box miter saw that I found actually works better. If you can get a finer tooth count saw, that tended to cut the spray foam better than the really coarse tooth saw that I was using here. I ended up using the coarse tooth saw for most of the van, and then finally switched to the box miter saw. I was like, oh, this is way better. So definitely look at getting a higher tooth count, finer cut saw for trimming up all the spray foam, because that was a lot of spray foam to trim out once we got going. And there's Lauren scraping it off the sides, wishing we had taped up those areas there. That was definitely a process getting it all off. But we ended up having right around 2 inches of coverage everywhere in the van. Maybe an inch, or had 1.5 inches in the floor just because we didn't need that much. And we ended up really not wasting a whole bunch of it. I think at the end of the day, we maybe cut off an entire trash bag full, like a kitchen trash bag full of the spray foam, which, if with just the cone nozzle, if I was able to get it that close, I imagine if I had used the fan nozzle, I probably could have gotten it much, much better and not had as much wasted. So looking back, I would definitely do that in the future, because the cleanup time, it took a little bit of time. It wasn't too terrible, and definitely wasn't the worst part of the van build, but something, if I had been a little more careful when I was spraying, I would have cut down on the time that we took cleaning up afterwards. We ended up actually spraying foam in the sliding door as well. And what I did is I kind of just used duct tape to create little like fillets basically in the corners to keep the spray foam from covering the door latch mechanism and the cable that runs to the door latch and all that stuff. And so we were able to get some spray foam in the sliding door as well. On the rear doors, I didn't try to shoot any in there. Eventually I'll come back with some great stuff and fill in the bottom section of those and leave a little space for the license plate and stuff like that. So those will get some later on down the road once we get closer to the end of the build. One thing that I did notice is the spray foam definitely works, because the day that we were cleaning all this off, I mean, you can see it, the sun is just beating down out there. I shot the temp gun at the metal that was exposed where the AC and fan vents are going to be, and the metal itself was about 145 degrees, and I shot the spray foam like 2 inches away from that, and the inside of the spray foam was, I think, like 90 degrees. So there was a 50-degree difference in the inside temperature of the van and the outside temperature of the van. So I would definitely recommend spray foam. I think it's one of the best choices to go if you have the budget to do it. I would do it again in a heartbeat. I think it's a great way to insulate a van. It did require a little bit of pre-planning and making sure we had our electrical conduit in and all our framing where we needed it. And it was a little stressful, but looking back, I definitely shouldn't have been as stressed out as I was to spray the spray foam. It was super easy to install, and like I said, would do it again if I could. So, hope you guys enjoyed this week's episode of the Van Build series. Hope you got some valuable information out of it. If you like what you saw, give us that thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, make sure you leave those below. We'll definitely be sure to get back to you on it. And if you're ready for more, hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications, and we'll be back next week with a new Van Build video. Thanks for watching.